Hello everyone, my name is Matt. I'm a freelance software developer and now motion designer out of Auckland, New Zealand. I started learning Cinema 4D in December of 2019, and 3 months later was contacted by a major international brand for my very first gig when they found my work on Behance. My very first render was this watery testicle looking sphere thing here, and within 3 months I was creating stuff like this. This is going to be the video I wish I had when I was starting to learn Cinema 4D. There's a ton of great tutorials out there around Cinema 4D, but not so much documenting the learning process, the resources that you should be using when you're first getting started, hardware decisions, what render engine you should go for, and what the actual process was like learning a Cinema 4D, because it's quite a difficult program to get started. So we're going to be answering all of those questions, as well as providing you a bunch of tips, all the resources that I used and what I would do differently if I was to do this again. If you're after timestamps and you want to know something specifically, then I'll have them all linked down below. But without further ado, let's get started. So for a bit of context, let's talk about why I learnt Cinema 4D in the first place. By day, I am a software developer, and I was getting a little bit bored just, building forms for people, and I needed something a little bit more creatively fulfilling, as well as being something else that I could offer clients as an extra service. I settled on motion design, particularly with Cinema 4D, because of its integration with the Lottie plugin. So you can take your animation and then you can export that out through Lottie. There's a series of still images, and you can put that into web-based projects where you can animate it, basically add a little bit more life into a website, so it's not just a static page. There were some other options as well when it came to what could be good for the type of work I was doing. After Effects obviously is vital. I actually have a friend who works in the motion graphics industry. He's worked on all of the Marvel films, all sorts of amazing stuff. Nicholas Hodgson, so you can go check out some of his work below. He has some tutorials on Gumtree as well. After talking with him for a little bit, we both decided that cinema was going to be for me. Blender, from what I could tell, was a very feature complete program. It's amazing. They've got a huge community there. That was one of the main benefits of going with Blender. They have a very open-minded, collaborative, community-focused community. Cinema 4D was a little bit more locked off because it was a paid program, whereas Blender is free. I went with Cinema 4D specifically because the type of work that I was looking to include in my web-based projects, as well as the type of work that I wanted to have as a portfolio on my Instagram, and I thought I would genuinely love to create, was based off Cinema 4D. If you're looking at getting into cinema and you're looking at Blender and Cinema 4D and Houdini, if that's the route that you want to go down, find out what kind of work you actually want to create, and then find out what type of programs that people are using to create that work. Again, the tools don't make the artist, but at the same time, you do have to kind of narrow down and pick something that you think is going to work well for you. Blender is absolutely fantastic, Cinema 4D also fantastic, but they do have slightly different use cases. Let's talk about my experience, my 30 days of learning Cinema 4D. It was challenging. It was super, super challenging. Especially when you're trying to be self-taught as well. Having some direction or having some kind of structured process is really difficult when you're not paying an institution to have that. So being self-taught I found that really difficult. I was very lost when I was getting started because I didn't know where to start, what tutorials to look at. I didn't know what tutorials were even worth my time, what the Cineversity stuff was, Greyscale Gorilla. There was so many different resources out there, and I just didn't know where to start. There is School of Motion, and they offer this full course where they take you from the basics all the way to the advanced stuff, and that's quite expensive. It was around $500 or $600. I'll have all this information in the article to support this and all the learning resources. But it was quite expensive, and I wanted to do this as cost effective as possible. So I was looking at the Greyscale Gorilla stuff. I was looking at a ton of YouTube tutorials, and there are so many. We'll get into this a little bit later on. There are so many fantastic creators on YouTube who are making Cinema 4D a lot more accessible. If you're one of those, Thank you very much. I found you incredibly useful. That was the first kind of bit. It was trying to find a direction of learning so I could use my month efficiently. I settled on the Greyscale Gorilla stuff because they have a ton of different training videos on there. They have some really advanced topics, so it scales pretty well. I'll do another whole video around the Greyscale Gorilla experience because I don't think that's what you should jump into, but we'll talk about that a little bit later on. I did find the Skillshare tutorials that I picked up, things like Don Mufasi, Patrick Foley, there was Andre Lebrov, there was iDesign as well, CG shortcuts. I found those project-based tutorials very, very useful. So I wanted to start off learning the fundamentals of cinema, and that was quite tricky. When you open Cinema 4D for the first time, it is very overwhelming, but you will get used to it. I promise. It just takes a little bit of time. Basically the things that you need to learn, and I'm gonna rattle them off very quickly here. Modeling, texturing, animating, lighting, keyframing, motion design or animation concepts, forces and dynamics, what render engine to choose, any kind of hardware associated with running Cinema 4D. There's a lot of different things that make up an image. You're gonna be learning how to use a camera, a virtual camera. You're gonna be learning how to make an object move through 3D space. You're gonna be learning about how to work in a 3D space. There's a lot of different things here that can really get you overwhelmed quite quickly, especially if you're learning by yourself and you don't have somebody to ask or to kind of help you out when you get stuck. And inevitably, you're gonna get stuck multiple times. I spent 3 days on a particular issue and somebody in the Greyscale Gorilla Slack fixed it in about, I think, half an hour. And that was completely off their own time. They were amazing. So thank you, Greyscale Gorilla chat. You were amazing. I started off mainly doing stills, or they call them style frames, I think. And that's basically just where you create a still image of something and render it out. And that could take anywhere between 10 seconds to 5 minutes, depending on how complex it is. And that's what I would suggest starting off with as well. It's creating still stuff that doesn't move. As soon as you move into animation, that's a whole other thing where you need quite powerful equipment to be able to be anywhere near efficient. Rendering out a series of 900 frames of something and then getting that wrong and having to re-render that again, because that happened to me. I had to re-render out things multiple times, which sometimes took up to 3 days to get a single animation out. It's very computationally expensive. So start off small, start off with the fundamentals, get your style frames good, essentially learn how to use lighting and all that kind of stuff. And that's basically how I started off. So I started off with the Skillshare tutorials for that, and they were beyond amazing. I'll throw up some examples of the things that I was creating, and a lot of the good stuff I found really came from Skillshare. So Don Mufasi and Patrick Foley, CG shortcuts, iDesign, they were all beyond amazing. And it's about kind of creating something that's fun, something that you can, you know, go and show somebody and they'll be like, oh, that's so cool. How did you do that? And you're like, I'm a genius, you know? When you're learning especially, you need those kind of like little victories. And sure, like doing a project, you're basically just following a set of instructions. But if you take that project and you turn it into something else, something that's uniquely your own, that's where you really start to feel a sense of accomplishment and progression. And that's what I would recommend you do as well. Throughout this month, I started off with the style frames, and then as I got a little bit more confident, I started working through the UI a little bit more. I wasn't having to constantly ask people how to do things. Then I started to get into animation. So I created this one with Don Mufasi's tutorial, and that was really cool. A lot of people really like that kind of vibe. That kind of set me on the animation path, which is really what ended up getting me a job, my very first motion graphics job with a major international brand. I can directly contribute the animations that I did for the Don Mufasi tutorials to the first basically original animation that I created, and then that got me a job doing motion graphics. It's pretty cool. So as you progress past kind of learning how to manipulate the primitive shapes, you start learning about forces and dynamics and how to work with those, how to create still frames based off of that. And you basically just kind of grow from there. It's still very complicated, but once you've kind of got the initial Cinema 4D stuff down, then you can start looking into third-party render engines, which trips up a lot of people. I think a lot of people spend a ton of time figuring out what render engine to go for. We'll talk about render engines a little bit later on because that requires talking about hardware as well, but we're talking about Cinema 4D for now. So in terms of the main issues that I found with Cinema 4D, especially being self-taught, is that you don't have access to somebody to help you out. A lot of these issues, the documentation for Cinema 4D isn't as good as I hope it would be. I think they can really improve on the documentation there. That was a big stickling point for me. It's also quite difficult to kind of figure out a structure in which to learn stuff, because there are so many different things involved with cinema and you don't really know what the fundamentals and the key concepts are. And that's where I find like a School of Motion program especially interesting, because that will give you more of a structured learning program. The Cineversity stuff I think is also fantastic. It's also free when you get Cinema 4D. So I would highly recommend looking into that if you're wanting something a bit more structured. Follow all the Cineversity stuff, it is free. One of the guys from iDesign also, he does a lot of those tutorials and they're beyond fantastic. So if you're looking for structure, highly recommend Cineversity or the School of Motion stuff. The other thing as well is that when you do get stuck and you are self-taught, you don't have anyone else to ask, online Slack communities are beyond amazing. There are some super helpful, amazingly talented people in there who are quite happy to just spend 10, 15 minutes of their time walking you through a problem, or they'll download your file, they'll figure out what's wrong, and then they upload it again and your issue is fixed. There are some very friendly, very passionate, community-oriented people who are willing to help you out. I think because they mainly know what it's like to be in that situation, especially if they're self-taught. So please get involved in an online community. The GSG one is amazing. I don't know about too many others, but the Greyscale Gorilla Slack community helped me out miles when I was starting, and some of the really frustrating things that I spent 2 days on had no idea how to fix, and somebody else could fix it in about 15 minutes. Please get involved with some kind of community, be a good person, provide value where you can, and then pay that forward once you kind of fix your issue, and document everything as well. Document the issues you have, because more than likely somebody else is going to have those issues as well when they're learning. I was quite happy with where I ended up after that month. I managed to go through a ton of Skillshare tutorials. I went through a lot of the Greyscale Gorilla stuff. I was getting more into the advanced concepts, so things like working with dynamics and forces, field forces, that kind of thing. It takes a while, it really does. It requires a lot of patience because there is a lot of things to cover within Cinema 4D, and you're not realistically going to be super proficient in a month's time. There's just a ton of stuff there. You could, if you're spending 8 hours a day for an entire month doing it. I didn't have that much time. But realistically, I think you can create some really, really cool stuff and figure out whether or not Cinema 4D is actually something that you want to continue with. There's, I think, a 2-week trial for Cinema 4D, so you can check that out. Now we're going to be talking about hardware and render engines, because this is something that really trips up a lot of people. What render engine do I choose? There are entire videos about this. I'll again link a couple below. Let's get into it. The main render engines you're going to see online are going to be Octane, Redshift, Arnold, and Corona. Your hardware choice as well, what systems you're currently using, are also going to impact what kind of render engines you're going to be able to use. There is also the physical or standard renderer, which comes bundled with Cinema 4D, which works across Mac and PC. If you're wanting to use something like Redshift or Octane specifically, that's bound to NVIDIA hardware and things like the MacBook, which I was learning on, you cannot use Redshift or Octane on a Mac yet. Apparently support for that's supposed to be coming, but as for now, not able to use it because they use AMD GPUs on those devices. If you're wanting to use all of the third-party render engines, you also have a good CPU or a GPU, something like a 3900X Plus or a NVIDIA GPU 2060 to 7080, then you basically get full reign of all the GPU engines. So things like Arnold, Redshift, Octane, Corona. I think Corona and Arnold are both CPU, and Redshift GPU and Octane GPU. If you're figuring out which one to learn, I would basically just pick whichever one you have access to resources. Essentially, I went with Redshift because the Greyscale Gorilla had a very in-depth guide to Redshift. I'm going to be checking out Arnold as well soon because they also just uploaded a very comprehensive Arnold tutorial series. Octane, I think, is very popular for people getting started because it just looks amazing. You don't have to tweak as much straight out of the box. So if you're wanting to go easiest possible, I would go Octane. There is a bit of a caveat with that in the fact that Octane apparently is less stable than Redshift and Arnold. It doesn't crash. It crashes more often than those two. I think Redshift and Arnold are also very good engines to get started with as well, primarily because they have more options available to you. They're more flexible, and you're going to have to learn how to texture objects. You do UVs and displacements and all that kind of stuff. I think at the end of the day, it'll make you a more well-rounded 3D artist if you really understand how to use Redshift or Arnold at the get-go. You can also very comfortably work within the standard and physical renderer and get very, very, very good with that. And that will make transitioning to something like Octane, Arnold, whatever else, easy as well, because you already know the fundamentals, and those basically kind of change and chop between each of the different render engines. They're just different buttons to press, essentially. or they call things differently. The fundamental concepts are the same, so you're not going to make an everlastingly long bad decision here. All of the render engines are good. You can produce fantastic results with both. I would go with Redshift or Arnold if I was feeling a little bit daring and I had time to kind of really invest into learning the two systems. If I wanted something a little bit quicker and easier and can also produce some amazingly Instagram-worthy results, I would maybe pick up Octane and see how it goes. A lot of these also offer free trials, so see which one works for you. I know that Arnold, for me personally, it just clicks a little bit better in my brain in terms of how it's structured and laid out. So yeah, there's that. Let's talk about hardware more specifically. We've talked about the AMD and GPU side, but a lot of people when they're learning Cinema 4D, they haven't gone out and bought a 13990X Threadripper multi-GPU system. They're most likely starting off on a laptop like I was. I started off on the 13-inch MacBook Pro that is currently recording the audio for this video. I've done a whole video based on learning Cinema 4D on a laptop. And so if you're looking at this video and you're on a laptop and you're like, oh, I'm not going to be able to run Cinema 4D on a laptop, you can 100% run and learn Cinema 4D on a laptop. Your experience is not going to be as good as someone who's got 4 2080s in a single rig. However, it's still going to be great. I basically did the bulk of my learning on a 13-inch MacBook Pro on the standard and physical renderer. HP were very kind to send me one of their high-end Omen laptops to use for checking out Redshift because that wasn't available to me on the Mac's ecosystem. It was a 15-inch device. It had a 144Hz screen, an RTX 2080, which is the top of the line GPU. It was the Max-Q version though, so it was a laptop version of the RTX 2080. They do have a 17-inch fully fledged RTX 2080 as well. It also had an i7 CPU in there. So I was able to do a mixture of CPU rendering as well as GPU rendering. I found the GPU rendering to be a little bit fast. So I went from a 13-inch MacBook, which was kind of like the bottom tier, all the way up to the top end of the mobile world. The main benefits between going from the MacBook to the HP Omen was that I was able to use Redshift, which was immensely vital in me getting the motion graphics job because they were using Redshift. It meant that I could develop and work faster. So when I was changing lighting, when I was changing out textures, previewing things, it meant that my IPR window, it just rendered faster. So I was able to make changes quicker and work more iteratively based off of that. It's something that I couldn't really do on my 13-inch MacBook Pro. It just took a bit longer. Being able to use something powerful like that as well, it's not a workflow restricted for like students either or people who are just learning. Andrei Lebrov, who is an amazing 3D artist who also has such an amazing YouTube channel, I would highly recommend going to check him out. He does all of his work, his look development work on his laptop, and then when he needs to render out something beefy, maybe that's not a style frame, it's an animation, he just sends it to his render farm at home or at his studio. It's a really elegant solution. So if you're thinking about buying a laptop to learn Cinema 4D on, think about that more as like an investment for your future, because you can do basically everything you need to do on a high-end laptop and then just send it out to a virtual render farm if you need to, or build a desktop PC after you've done a couple of jobs, and you can use that as your render engine as well. You have that flexibility to kind of go where you please, whether that's in between houses or to university, do your work there and at home, or go to a client's office and be able to do some look development on site with them. It's a really, really nice solution. So thank you very much, HP, for exposing me to that kind of level of flexibility. I really appreciate that. I'll link some of the details for the HP Omen that I used down below so you can go and check that out, maybe if it's something worth looking into for you. Let's talk about learning resources, because that's probably what you're here for, to find a curated list of people to go and learn from. I'll have these all linked down below so you don't have to listen to my voice. I'm just going to give you a little bit more context around the kind of stuff that they do so you can make a decision based off that. So first of all is the Skillshare people. So people like Patrick Foley, Visual Dawn or Don Mufasi, CG Shortcuts and iDesign. They all have beyond amazing project-based tutorials. They're less about kind of concepts and more about creating something really, really cool. It's a very good feeling when you can see kind of what you're going to be able to create, because a lot of those tutorials, you will be able to create the exact same thing that they're showing you. It's amazing, and then you can change that and modify that and do what you want. So I would highly recommend the Skillshare tutorials. It's also very price efficient in terms of the value that you're going to be getting out of that subscription. So Skillshare, I would highly recommend checking out. There's going to be a link below. It is an affiliate link, but the tutorials down there are absolutely amazing and I would highly recommend them. We've got Andre Lebrov, who just, oh man, he's just so good. Patrick Foley as well, Visual Dawn, they're all on YouTube. CG Shortcuts, iDesign, Greyscale Gorilla also have some fantastic tutorials up there as well. Greyscale Gorilla, they do a lot of more advanced type of tutorials. They are a paid service, but they also have a YouTube channel as well, which provides a ton of value. In terms of podcasts, the School of Motion podcast, I really enjoyed. The guys who run that are fantastic. Sorry, guys and girls. Motionography as well. Greyscale Gorilla also have a fantastic podcast. They're all very entertaining, very personable, and you'll get a lot of good information out of that too. In terms of paid resources, I basically only use the Greyscale Gorilla Plus content. Now, this was a very, very compelling buy for me because not only did you get a lot of good resources for learning Cinema 4D, so basically their fundamentals course starts off at R14. I don't really recommend that because even though the fundamentals are there, it's quite outdated now. I would definitely recommend going and checking out the Cineversity course, which is free, and that's a lot more modern. You create some really cool stuff with that. But the rest of the content on Greyscale Gorilla's site is best in class, I think. They have some really great tutorials around forces and dynamics, advanced Redshift training, Arnold training as well. They have some really cool like project-based stuff as well for like titles. It's a very good service, and bundled with the community that it comes with, so you get access to the Greyscale Gorilla Slack. That was entirely money very, very well spent. If you were looking at getting the Greyscale Gorilla Plus thing straight away, maybe not. The reason that I did is because you got access to a whole bunch of materials. So you got, I think, 2 material packs, the everyday material collection as well as the modern service material collection, I think it's called. And that basically meant that I didn't have to go and learn texturing straight away. I could just slap a pre-made texture on it, and it was fantastic. I really enjoyed that. So if you're wanting the textures, then it's still very good, but I would maybe recommend checking out the free stuff first and the Skillshare. And then if this is something that you really want to dive into, or you want some more advanced tutorials around Redshift and Arnold, because I've yet to find better tutorials on Redshift and Arnold than the ones on the Greyscale Gorilla site, then I would jump into that after you've kind of got your feet wet a little bit. I should also mention that one of the reasons why I was really excited about Cinema was its integration with Webflow specifically. It's what I use to build all of my client websites, and Webflow have some really good tutorials around integrating the Cinema 4D with the Lottie plugin and then straight into the Webflow project. So that was another big sell for me. Webflow do an absolutely fantastic job of their learning resources, so it made the decision quite easy. Now, for what I would do differently this time around, if I was to do the entire month again, what would I do? How would I structure it? Here we go. I would spend less time wondering about what render engine to choose. I would just pick one and go. I would start off with the standard and physical and get to know that extremely well. And then after I've got the fundamentals down of how to texture, how to UV, how to do all that kind of stuff, then I would move on to Redshift or Arnold or Octane. Doesn't really matter, just learn one, stick with it, and then once it starts to bug you or you really like some other things, then you can go learn that too. It's not as if you have to compromise and just learn one. You can learn everything if you want to. I would initially start off as well with the Cineversity tutorials. Those are very high value. They want you to learn the program. They want you to get good with the program, because the better you get and the longer you have the subscription, the more money they make at the end of the day. So the Cineversity stuff is actually really high quality. Just because it's free doesn't mean it's bad. It's actually very, very, very good. So I'd start off with the Cineversity stuff basically first and foremost. And after I've done that, I would also do the Skillshare tutorials. That's a very kind of low cost entry to learning Cinema 4D. So I think the Skillshare is around between 15, 20 bucks a month. You're gonna have to check the prices on that. But the Skillshare stuff, there are a ton of amazingly talented artists on Skillshare who do some amazing Cinema 4D tutorials. They're very project-based, but you'll be able to create some very practical, very cool things that'll give you more of a taste as to whether or not you actually want to do Cinema 4D. After I started with the Skillshare and done a lot of the YouTube tutorials, then I would look at getting something like Greyscale Gorilla Plus, because the everyday material packs, the collection packs that come with the Plus subscription are absolutely phenomenal. They also have a ton of great other products available too. They have advanced training on Redshift and Arnold. They have been very good with updating the GSG Plus library of content over the last couple of months. It hasn't been too many things over the last month or so, but apparently they're just waiting for NAB to kick off some new content. So that's basically how I'd structure that. I would try and do as many practical things as possible, things that are gonna generate you like an Instagram post or portfolio piece. And then, you know, you can go off from there into your motion graphics journey and get a job and start working. And then after you've done that, you can buy a PC, and then you've got a gaming rig and a rig that's gonna make you money, and it's a tax write-off. So win-win-win. That's basically my Cinema 4D journey so far. So thank you very much if you've stuck around this long. I have Instagram down below. Leave any comments if you've got any around learning resources that I've missed, because I'm sure I have. There are a ton of great content creators on here who do stuff with Cinema 4D. Theo Kerr as well, he was also another one, he was fantastic. Yeah, that about wraps up this half-hour long video. So thank you very much if you've stuck around, really appreciate it. I will be doing some more Cinema 4D content in the future, so like and subscribe, you know, if that's a thing. And we will see you in the next one. Also, thank you very much, HP, for sending out the laptop. I wouldn't have been able to test Redshift without it, so cheers guys, I appreciate you very much. That'll be all. Thank you very much, and I will see you in the next one.